Decades before bearing presses for bicycles were readily available, we'd be out on site fixing spin bikes in health clubs and putting bearings into bottom brackets. Sometimes we'd have to do 4 at a time, and they're much bigger than the ones you use on a wheel in a bike. And this is the homemade press that we would do that with. They still don't make them like they used to. I have a rear cyclocross wheel here, and the bearings are as hard to get in and out of this as they are out of a bottom bracket in a spin bike. The tippity-tappity antics I've seen on YouTube with people trying to get bearings in and out just wouldn't cut the mustard in this scenario. I'm going to show you how I replace sealed wheel bearings with some stuff that you can just find in your workshop or find pretty cheaply at your local hardware store. The old trick where you use a bit of threaded studding, some nuts and some washers would just be left by the wayside by this cyclocross wheel. I do it this way because it's the easiest way to do it and it doesn't do any damage to the wheel itself. You can even use this method when a bearing press just won't do the job. You want to stick around to the end to catch all the steps, because if you miss any out, you could end up in disaster and having to replace your wheel. Later in the video, I'm going to show you some tips about tools you should have in your workshop. So buckle your toe straps and let's get on with it. You've just got to become the bike. So let's take a look at the tools we're going to use for this job today. So the first ones we're looking at here are the minimum you're going to need to get this job done. Because I know this is quite a tough job, and for good practice, I also have these other tools at the other end of the bench, which I'm going to be using quite a lot of today as well. If you can, it's a good idea to get the bearings before you even start pulling it apart, if you know what sizes they are. Get your wheel out of the bike and get the cassette off, and also the rotor if it has one. You want to pull the end caps off the axle or unscrew them if they're done with Allen keys or something like that. And if they won't come off, like these ones didn't really want to, what you want to do is get them in the vise with some soft jaws and just lightly clamp it so it just grips it, and then whack the wheel up on the edge of the rim. If it doesn't work the first time, just try again, but you might want to turn the wheel around in the vise a little bit so where you're hitting it is different to the first place, giving it a better chance of coming off. Once you've got them off, you can just pull the freewheel body off the axle and out of the wheel. Sometimes it helps just to turn it backwards a little bit as you do that so the pulls aren't really engaged. At this point, I like to check the pulls, just make sure they move nicely and that they haven't got any grit in them. If they have, you might just want to blow it out with something or take them out and re-grease them back in. Often there's a little spacer behind the free hub body to stop it touching the bearing that's inside the hub. You want to just remove that as well and put it aside. I like to put all my stuff together on the right side of the wheel that it came out of and in the order that it came out of, so I know how it goes back in later on. More times than not, you'll find that there's a spacer in between the bearings in the free hub body. And just have a look inside, and if it's in line with the bearing so you can see straight through it, and you can't see the bearing at the other end of the free hub body, what you want to do is just move it to the side somehow. I just use something like a screwdriver, but you just don't want to damage it, so just be a bit careful. And you want to move it so that you can see the inside race of the other bearing, the one that you want to hit out first. In this instance, it's the outboard bearing. And then you get the free hub body, and I've got this Hope tool here, which the free hub just sits into, and you just sit it on the vise with the jaws open. And you want to get yourself a drift. I mean, you can do this with a screwdriver, but a drift is a lot better because it gives you a bigger surface area. And you just want to start tapping it out with a hammer. Sometimes you have to hit it quite hard. You want to be turning the free hub body round so you're not always whacking on the same side so it comes out square. This will just make the job a lot easier. I also have this modified screwdriver where I've just wedged the end of it out so it's got a little tang on it so I can get in behind a bearing and knock it out. Once the outboard bearing's out, the spacer will probably just drop out as well, and you want to just put both of them to the side. Have a good look inside, because often there's a circlip holding the inner bearing into the free hub body. And if that's the case like it is now, then you'll have to get a pair of circlip pliers and just fiddle around in there until you can grab the circlip and pull it out. Once that's out, you want to put the free hub body back into the holder. You can also do this just on the jaws of the vise. You want to open them up so the edge of the free hub body sits on the jaws of the vise, but leaves enough room for the bearing to fit through the jaws when you knock it out. Once you've got it in there, just do the same as you did with the outside bearing and just knock it out with the drift, working your way around it until it goes all the way through and pops out. If you're getting value out of this, please smash the like button down the bottom and share it with anyone you think would benefit from it. Now we're going to get the bearings out of the hub shell. We're going to start with the offside bearing. So what you want to do is get a nylon mallet. Don't use a normal metal hammer for this because you'll damage the axle. The best way to get them out is get a big piece of wood that's got a hole drilled in it that's bigger than the axle, but not bigger than the hub shell. And you just rest the hub shell on that above the hole, and I'm just using a screwdriver to make sure it is above it, exactly. And then you just want to hit the axle until it drives the offside bearing out of the hub. And the axle should come out straight with it, and you just take the bearing off the axle. Now if you can't get that off, but you should be able to, but if you can't get it off, you can just put the axle in the vise, not so it's gripping it, but so it's closed enough so the bearing can just sit on the top of it and just knock the axle back out of the bearing. Now if the bearing's being hard to get out, a bit of a bugger, then just spray some penetrating fluid in there and let it soak in a little bit to help you get it out. This is the same for any of the bearings, whether it be in the hub shell or in the free hub body. Now some hubs will have a spacer inside it between the two hub bearings. And when you take the axle out, that should come out as well. And you can just put that aside with the other bits. Once you've done that, you want to turn the axle around and put it in backwards so it goes through the hub and into the drive side bearing. And then you want to do exactly the same thing as you did with the non-drive bearing. Put it on the piece of wood over the hole and then tap it out. And in this case, because it was really, really hard in there, and I don't think it was just because it's seized, because it was really tight fit, you had to really give it some wellies. So I had to do it on the floor. You'll want to clean any muck or rust or anything out of the hub shell and the free hub body with some sort of lubricant. The reason you should use a lubricant is because some of it will always stay in there no matter how hard you try and get it out. And if you use a degreaser, all you're doing is getting the bearings to start to wear out quicker than they otherwise would do. Right, now we've done that, it's time to get the wheel bearings back in the wheel. So what you want to do is get a bit of grease and just squirt it into the free hub body where you're going to put the first bearings. I also usually put a little bit of grease on the bearing as well. This will help them slide in easier. It'll help you get them out if you have to in the future, but it'll also help waterproof the hub. Get the free hub body and seat the inner bearing into the free hub body just using your hand. And then what I do is I get a socket that will just fit inside the free hub body and moves around a tiny amount so it doesn't get stuck in there, but it's wide enough so it pushes against the outer race of the bearing to press it in. You don't want to be pushing on the inner race or on the actual rubber seals because that will just damage the bearing and it'll probably be no better than the ones you took out. And then I'll put it in the vise and make sure it's all nicely lined up and I just slowly close the vise. This one here is making a bit of noise and they just sometimes do that. It's because they're an interference fit. That's what keeps them in there. Once you've got the bearing in, you want to take it out of the vise, and in this case, you need to get your circlip pliers and get the circlip and refit it inside the free hub body to hold the bearing in. Now I just get a little screwdriver afterwards and just push down on the circlip just to make sure it's seated all the way around. Get your spacer, if it had one, and put that in there. If you haven't already put some grease in the outer part of the free hub body where the outer bearing's going, you want to put some in there now, and then just seat that in there with your hand. Just get your socket and put it up against the bearing and then put that in the vise again and just squeeze the bearing in, making sure it's going in nice and straight. Once it's seated in there, you can just take it back out of the vise. Every workshop that gets more than a little bit of use should have at least one bench vise in it. We've got two in here. We've got a smallish one, which we just use normal things in like fishing freewheels, that sort of thing. We've also got a bigger one that can swivel around to make jobs easier when it's hard to get in there with the bench in the way. If you're going to have a vise, you should really have some soft guards for it. It just makes it easier to put things in the vise and grip them up without damaging them. They're easy to make. You just need to get yourself some little sheets of copper, put them in the vise where you want to bend them and whack them over with a mallet. I also made myself a set of these little diddy ones, and they're basically for holding small things in the vise that I don't want fouled by the long tangs on the bigger ones. Now it's time to get the bearings back in the hub shell. So let's get our soft jaws in the vise and then put this G-clamp in the vise and tighten it up. This is what we're going to be using to press the hub bearings in. We're going to start with the drive side bearing, and what we're going to do is we're going to get a piece of wood and just put it across the non-drive side, and we're just going to strap it to the spokes with some toe straps. You could use some zip ties for this if you wanted to, or maybe some tape or something. This is just going to protect the hub shell on the non-drive side while we press the other bearing in. We put that in the G-clamp, and then we get the bearing, and if there's no grease on it, put some on it and make sure there's some in the hub as well. And then you just want to seat the new bearing into the hub shell as far as you can with your hand and make sure it's nice and flat and square. I then get a piece of wood on the other side and put that on the bearing, and I screw the G-clamp closed against it, and then I just slowly press it in until it's into the hub as far as the edge of the hub shell. Once I've done that, I get my socket again and I put the socket onto the bearing, and then I get a piece of wood above the socket, and this just stops the bearing and the actual G-clamp fouling each other and just kind of not going in straight. And then I just press the bearing in until it seats in there properly. You just want to put the socket on top of the bearing, make sure it's sitting there square so that the bearing's actually being touched by the socket on the outer edge and nowhere else, and then just slowly wind it down and press it in. Take the wheel out of the vise and then get your hub axle and any spaces it may have had inside it beforehand and put that back into the wheel the right way round. And then you want to get the other bearing, again with some grease on it and maybe some grease in the hub, and you want to just push that down onto the actual axle and into the hub as far as you can with your hand. And then you want to get the big piece of wood with a hole in it and put that on the G-clamp, and then put the hub over the piece of wood so the axle lines up with the hole again. And then you can just get a piece of wood like you did on the other side, put that on the bearing, and then just screw the G-clamp closed and push it in until it reaches the end of the actual lip of the hub. And once it's done that, you can either get the socket again and just use that to press the bearing in the rest of the way. Sometimes what I do is I get the old bearing and I put that on top of the new bearing, and then I just press it in that way as well. This pretty much always works with the bearing because the hub's not made to grip the bearing on the outside. It's usually a bit wider there. If there are any aha moments you had in this video, please drop in the comments below so I know what you're getting benefit from. Now that we've got the bearings into the free hub body and into the hub itself, we want to get our free hub body and we want to fit it back to the axle and back into the wheel. Now the first thing to do when you do that is to get a bit of grease and get some on the axle. Also squirt a bit of grease into the ratchet ring. You don't want to put too much in there, because if you do put too much in, sometimes you can stop the pull springing out properly, and so it won't engage when you're riding and you'll get no drive. I sometimes even put a little bit of oil in there as well, just to make it a little bit thinner and so it's a little bit slicker. Make sure the spacer between the free hub bearings is in line with the bearings. And if it's not, you can just try and push it out of the way. But if you can't move it, because it's quite tough, you want to just put it on the bench, put a long handled screwdriver in it, and then just push down on it, and that should line it right up for you. The first thing you want to do is slide the spacer that goes behind the free hub body and outside the hub bearing on. Then you want to slide on the free hub body. Slide it over the axle, and as it gets towards going into the actual hub itself, you want to just turn it backwards a little bit, because that makes the pulls click in and then allows them not to foul on the actual ratchet ring as it goes into the hub, and it should just pop straight in. Once the free hub body's back on, you can just get your end caps and either screw them back into the axle or just push them back on if they're like these ones, which are just push fit. Before I get the end caps on, I like to put a bit more grease on the outside of the bearings. This is really just to add more waterproofing to the hub to make it last a lot longer. Next thing to do is to get your cassette back on the wheel, get your rotor back on the wheel, and get it back in the bike. For any other specialist wheel maintenance videos, you can just check them out over here.